of that book, and the thesis is we need to sustain democratic relations with some of our political enemies if we're going to sustain democratic relations with our allies. The central argument of the Sustaining Democracy book really boils down to that. If you want to be a good ally to your political friends, you need to uphold democratic relations with at least some of your political enemies. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that, but I just want to say, and I'll do some unpacking in the talk today, but I just want to highlight to start, I don't intend this to be just a straightforwardly prudential or instrumental argument. Although it has instrumental or prudential features, I'm going to unpack it in a way that shows you that this is a moral argument. Now, maybe it's obvious to some of you that we in fact do need to sustain democratic relations even with our political foes, because after all, they're entitled to that kind of regard. And I'm not even denying that there's an obvious path towards the conclusion that you do need to sustain civil democratic relations with your foes. I just want to suggest that there's something philosophically to be gained by taking seriously an argument that says you don't have to uphold or seek to maintain civil relations with political opponents. That is, I think that there's something to be gained by giving due consideration to the argument that says justice is important, democracy gives us certain tools for pursuing justice, let's just play to win. And if that means deracinating, destabilizing, dismissing, discounting anybody who's not with us, so be it. Justice is at stake. Now, I'm going to proceed in 3 steps. The first sort of unpacks the thought I just gave voice to in terms of a dilemma. I want to suggest that there's a moral conflict at the heart of democratic citizenship that's not the result of anyone falling down on the job, but in fact is embedded or baked into the moral responsibilities of the citizen. That's what I call the Democrat's dilemma, and even though it's capital D there, I don't mean Democrat in the sense of the political party. And I want to suggest there that there's often good moral reason to just play to win. Then I want to talk about a cognitive phenomenon that I know some of you have probably heard me talk about a lot before, called belief polarization. This is different from the more political or sociological phenomenon of two sides pulling apart so the middle ground falls between them. This is a psychological and cognitive phenomenon that has to do with the tendency of members of like-minded groups to become more extreme in their beliefs and attitudes. I want to suggest that there's an often overlooked feature of belief polarization that's really, really important in thinking about the ethics of democratic citizenship, that has to do with the tendency of our more extreme selves to also be more conformist, more invested in being alike with our allies. And that's going to be the key to trying to suggest that unchecked belief polarization doesn't only foul our relations with our opponents, it actually undermines our capacities that enable us to be good democratic allies. Finally, I'm going to draw the threads together, give the moral argument of why we ought to seek to sustain civil relations even with our political enemies, and then try to say, but for all the reasons why this whole thing is a problem, the how question, how can we do it, is going to be very, very difficult. I don't do optimism, so I'm not really optimistic about our capacity to actually do what we're required to do, but that's might come up a little bit later. Okay, so to start, we think about democracy in all kinds of ways. We tend to think of democracy in terms of its most common or manifest institutional forms: voting, elections, shaking hands, kissing babies, money raising, lobbying, these sorts of things. It's really hard to make sense of why those institutional and practical forms loom so large in our understanding of democracy unless we see those institutions and practices to be in the service of what I'm going to say is an ideal, the ideal of self-government among political equals. Now, I mean ideal here in the sense of an aspiration. We call a society democratic insofar as its institutions and practices and overall ethos reflect an aspiration to achieve a self-governing community or society of equals. Now, one of the things that falls out of political equality is that we get to make up our own minds about politics. That's just one of the faces of political equality, is that, in epistemic terms, we might be irrational if we don't defer to certain forms of expertise. It might involve some kind of wrongdoing if we don't defer. But from the point of view of our role as citizens, we don't have to defer to anybody. We're not anybody's subordinate or lackey or superior or boss. And what that means is that within a broad spectrum of opinion, we get to make up our own minds. That means that self-government among political equals is always going to be self-government among political equals who disagree about some pretty important things, including questions that invoke differences about what justice is all about. Now, once you understand that political equality has that upshot of disagreement about pretty serious matters, it becomes easier to see that there's a conflict between what I want to suggest are two responsibilities of democratic citizenship. On the one hand, the community of self-governing equals is a community where citizens are required to take responsibility for the political order that they are in part the authors of. Now, what that means is that citizens are normally under a moral obligation to be participants rather than patients, to be active rather than passive, to build coalitions, to inform themselves, to get involved in politics in some way, and to act in ways that aim at furthering justice as they best can see it. Secondly, citizens are also one another's equals. That is, you might think of these two responsibilities as falling out of two different dimensions of political equality. We're vertically equal in that we are not merely the government's subjects or property, so we are equals in government and equals before the law and that sort of good stuff. But we're also one another's equals, so we're equal to one another. And what that means is that even when we win at the polls, even when our side prevails democratically, the other side remains our equals. They remain entitled to an equal say. That's why they get to keep on criticizing and challenging. They don't just have to shut up after they lose. So what that means is that in our attempts to take responsibility for the political order, we're also under a moral requirement to manifest a due regard for the equality of our fellow citizens. And what that typically means is that we owe them a certain standard of conduct, that is, in making up our minds about politics. We are under a requirement to consult them, to try to understand them, to try to see what our fellow citizens think, to try to appreciate the perspectives from which they come to political questions, and maybe to listen to them. Maybe it's to deliberate with them. The requirement can get pretty thick. But even on a thin version of the requirement, there is a requirement of citizenship to not see your fellow citizens as simply obstacles. That might be a way to put it. You might say that it's part of the ethics of the democratic citizen with respect to her fellow citizens to not adopt the Straussonian objective stance towards anyone who's not on your side of the questions. You have to take the participant stance, or the civic equivalent of the Straussonian participant stance. Okay. So that means that our political advocacy should be informed by some attempt to engage with, consult, consider the perspectives of others. Now, there's a lot more to be said about all of that, but we're going to move on. Because I think that this is enough just to show you that there's a dilemma. That's what's going on the other side of the screen. Disagreements about politics aren't always, but are often disagreements about what justice requires. And when we find among our fellow citizens, or when we find that we have fellow citizens who disagree with us about justice requires, we're bound to see them as not merely on the other side of the question, but on the wrong side of the question. We will see their advocacy for their position as not merely wrong-headed, but in the wrong. We will judge them as advocates for something less than or other than justice. And we will see them as, or we are bound to see them as, in the wrong for advocating the way that they do. That is to say, the responsibility for furthering justice seems to pull us in the direction of abandoning the responsibility to certain of our fellow citizens. Now, when we're in the throes, when we're in the throes of politics, when the political stakes seem high, extending to those who are on the other side of the political question feels like a moral concession to them. It feels like a rotten compromise. It feels like it's giving voice to unjust views. Feels like it's playing a role that makes it complicit in the injustice of the other side's view. Moreover, when we extend to the other side a hearing or a platform or a chance to express their concerns or defend their views, it looks like, to our allies, it looks like we're being soft. It looks like we're making a concession to them. It looks like we're not authentic allies. It might even jeopardize our alliances to take the stance that the people on the other side, despite the injustice of their views, nonetheless have to be regarded or heard or listened to. That is it. We run the risk of appearing to our allies as if we're posers. If you think there's another side to the question, maybe you're on it, is the thought that we invite from our allies. Now, when you put it that way, it looks like, well, then there's a clear, right? Extending to fellow citizens who are on the wrong side of the question, all of the consulting, the platforming, the listening stuff, looks like if it weakens our alliances, it looks like it runs counter to the responsibility to do what we can to see justice done. That's what I call the Democrats' dilemma. And again, I want to suggest or emphasize, this is not a problem or a challenge for democracy that emerges from some external force in the world, some anti-democratic or non-democratic norm sort of worming its way into the democratic stance and messing it up. So it's not a Michael Walzer story about injustice where the wrong norm gets involved in and starts governing things it's not suited for. This is internal to democracy. In fact, the empirical stuff suggests feeling the pinch of this dilemma is positively correlated with higher levels of political information and higher self-reportage of political action, right? The more active you see yourself politically, the more likely you're to feel the pinch of this conflict. Now, note, you can get the conflict, you can formulate the conflict without having to say, what will strike me as ridiculous things like democratic citizens have to listen to critics and opponents no matter what they say. This is not an argument or this is not a dilemma that requires you to deny that some views are beyond the pale, right? Forget about the fascists and the authoritarians and the Nazis among us for a second. You still get the dilemma. Even if we're not thinking about, well, there's the people who are advocates of democracy, and then there are these anti-democratic agents that thrive because of the freedoms and the social conditions that democracy allows, and they're free riders on the democratic system. I'm not talking about that. Just talking about people who just disagree with you about immigration, the tax policy. Think of anything. Even if you just think of people who fall in the same region of the political spectrum, they will have political disagreements. Some of those disagreements will be disagreements about what justice is all about. Those disagreements then will be visible to the parties to those disagreements as disagreements over justice. That's all you need. You're slightly more progressive about taxation than I am? Well, we might be distracted from that fact because we're fighting against somebody who's even more out of step with justice about taxation. But we stop thinking about those people, we've still got a battle, we still have a disagreement about justice on our hands. I'm a prison abolitionist. You are somebody who just advocates for real extreme criminal justice reform. Okay, we're allies with respect to a certain set of political forces. But that doesn't mean we're not that we don't have a disagreement, we just haven't engaged yet about justice. Once you and I start talking about criminal justice reform or prison abolition, I have to see you as somebody who, you think that some people should be in jail. That's unjust, right? That's still a disagreement about justice. Okay. Now, the Democrats' dilemma, we might say, sort of raises in us the possibility that maybe all opponents are beyond the pale. Because my views are the views that are required by justice or are the best response to our attempt to figure out what justice requires. So therefore, anybody who's not on my side must be an advocate of injustice. And so therefore, why not just treat them as dismissible, right? Good. Why not just stand up for justice instead? Now, we begin to see a way to make the case, despite this moral stuff about standing up for justice, to make the case for maintaining democratic relations with our foes by looking at a phenomenon called belief polarization. Now, the term polarization is used in all kinds of ways in popular commentary. I'm going to use it in a very specific way to talk about a social cognitive phenomenon rather than an empirical sociological phenomenon. Typically when people talk about polarization, they're talking about two opposed parties and the ideological distance between them growing so extreme that the middle ground falls out and they can't communicate or cooperate or get anything done. Belief polarization is this, again, cognitive phenomenon. It's the regularity with which interaction with like-minded others turns us into more extreme versions of ourselves. Now, for the philosophers in the room, extremity there means interactions with like-minded others leads us to adopt more extreme contents of our beliefs with a higher degree of confidence with which we held their antecedents and a greater amount of fervency in our overall epistemic perspective. So we become more fervently environmentalists, we become more confident in our more extreme environmentalist beliefs, more extreme than the beliefs we entered the interaction with. Now, this is a widely studied phenomenon. It's not peculiar to or specific to political beliefs. It's not even specific to normative beliefs. like-minded groups that agree on the elevation of Denver, Colorado. The longer they talk about Denver being notably high above sea level, the higher they think Denver is. That's just purely banal empirical stuff, right? So it's not just about evaluative or normative things. It's not just about political things. It just looks like it's a feature of just social dynamics. It's been studied all over the world. It's pretty robust. It might be, it's often called the most robust, non-trivial social psychological finding we have. And we could talk about it if you want. The thing I want to focus on here, though, is that the shift towards extremity in belief polarization also involves what's sometimes called the risky shift. As we become more extreme, we become more tolerant of risky behavior on behalf of the more extreme beliefs, and more ready to engage in more risky behavior on behalf of our more extreme beliefs. Now, there are lots of questions I can talk about in the Q&A, but let's move on. Belief polarization doesn't only work inside our heads. Belief polarization also affects our views of people who we regard as outside of the like-minded group, or it affects our views of outsiders. Our more extreme selves are also more insular, more invested in policing the boundary between allies and enemies, more negatively disposed towards anyone who's perceived to be an outsider. That is, you don't even need a lot of evidence that they are outsiders, right? If you just perceive them to be different, you start adopting more intensely negative dispositions towards them. You evaluate them more negatively, you attribute more malign motives to them. The way they dress seems bad to you, the way they live their lives seems objectionable to you, even if the way they dress and the way they live their lives is not in any objective sense different from some of the ways that your friends live and live their lives. We become more dismissive of what they say. In experimental contexts, we become more likely to interrupt them when they're speaking. We become less able to report after conversation things that they've said in ways that show that or suggest that we understood them to be given reasons, so they look to us inscrutable and irrational. We attribute to, or we come to attribute to people who are perceived to be outsiders, only the most extreme versions of opposing views. So we come to see them as monolithic and extreme and committed to the least plausible versions of the opposing side's view. Now, all of that looks to me like it's bad news for democracy. But remember the Democrats' dilemma. Maybe not, right? This is why I emphasize the risky shift stuff. You might say, well, wait a minute. The people on the other side, why should I care about having a good view of them? They're on the side of injustice. Belief polarization makes us more ready to act, less likely to waste time trying to figure out what the people on the other side are on about, less willing to treat them as reasonable partners. Hey, that sounds great to trying to get a just result. Belief polarization, that is, looks like it's not a bad thing if you've adopted the democratic strategy of playing to win. Now here's the problem. Not only does belief polarization make us more extreme and more insular with respect to perceived outsiders, belief polarization also affects our views of our allies. Our more extreme selves, it turns out, are more conformist. Let me unpack that. As we shift with our allies into more extreme and intense attitudes, dispositions, and commitments, not only do we become more alike our allies across an expanding range of behaviors. So it's not merely that we come to hold the same more radical version of the views that we walked into, we do. belief polarized groups tend to be converging on a particular commitment rather. Belief polarized groups start to behave in similar ways across a broad range of behaviors. This is why. Next time you're listening to someone speak about the Middle East, and you hear them pronounce the name of the country whose name is spelled I-R-A-N or I-R-A-Q, you can tell if they're liberal or if they're conservative by paying attention to how they pronounce the word. Iraq versus Iraq, okay? And I don't even have to tell you how that divide splits. You know, right? Okay. So certain words start getting pronounced in similar ways. They start dressing alike. And you can see, sort of with a toy theory about how this works, a group that becomes more invested, more intense in its position is also going to start developing less formal modes of signaling allyship to other members of the group, right? Got to learn the signals. There's like secret handshakes and stuff. There are hats you have to wear and lapel pins you've got to put on, right? This is not surprising and probably shouldn't be surprising to anyone who went to high school in the United States, because this is just what cliques are. The important part here, though, is that as belief polarized groups become more alike, they become more invested in being alike. That's the point about conformists. They become more conformists. They become more interested in maintaining their alikeness. So more disposed to challenge deviation from the dominant expectations in the group. They become more invested in policing their membership, not just policing the border between who's in and who's out, but policing the membership so that the members behave in ways that are similar. They become more invested in poser detection and purity tests. Think about Liz Cheney for a second. And more invested in establishing clear boundaries, not between who's in and out, they are invested in that, but clear boundaries between authentic and poser or fake counterfeit membership in the group. As they become more invested in alikeness, they naturally also become more hierarchical. If you've got a social group that's invested in its alikeness, especially if it's large, you need a very strong centralized set or particular person to be the standard or agenda setter. Somebody who's going to be able to signal clearly to the membership what legit, authentic, invested membership looks like. So belief polarized groups become less internally democratic, less internally tolerant of deviation, more internally invested in uniformity. Some of you might know about the black sheep effect. Belief polarized groups are also susceptible to higher grades of the black sheep effect. The black sheep effect is the regularity or the tendency that we have. We have more intensely negative attitudes towards perceived posers, members of our group who are not authentic or not legit. We hate them more and want to punish them more than we hate and want to punish people who we just see as enemies. Okay. Great. So, just to sum up, as groups believe polarized, they become more hierarchical, less internally democratic, more exclusionary, that is more interested in keeping outsiders out, more intensely fixated on detecting and expelling perceived posers, and more interested in punishing people who look like they're tending towards behavior and attitudes and dispositions that are not in line with the central demands of membership. Now, look what's just happened. we were considering somebody who's in the grip of the Democrats' dilemma saying, screw it, I'm going to fight for justice. I'm not going to care about those other people. I'm just going to get my allies together and we're going to go and do what justice says we need to do. Seems like a morally admirable thing or stance to take until you realize that once you dismiss your opponents, your enemies even, the forces, the cognitive forces, the social dynamical forces of belief polarization don't simply dissipate. They turn inward, right? They turn you against your allies. And so, one of the hard truths of democracy, among many, but one of them is, if you want to have an effective political voice, you have to join a choir. Right? Got to join a group. If you want the group to be effective, you've got to build it. You've got to grow it. You've got to make it strong. Belief polarization leads to groups dividing into factions, splintering, at each other's throats, because of the black sheep effect, more vehemently at each other's throats than they are with the perceived enemies. Or we might just put it in this sort of straightforwardly cognitive sense. Belief polarization encourages us to adopt the attitude, the stance, more or less explicitly, that democracy is possible only when everyone agrees with me. That is a profoundly anti-democratic thought, right? Good. So, we've seen then that we need to sustain democracy with our enemies if we're going to uphold democratic relations with our allies. That is one sort of major tier of the argument of the Sustaining Democracy book. Note, this is not simply a prudential argument. It's not simply like, well, you want to pursue justice, and you're tempted to just cut off all civil relations with people who are not on your side of the questions so that you can just focus on getting the just result. Well, hey, that's a bad strategy. Don't do that. So instead, you gotta, keep channels open for democratic relations with your opponents, because it's just strategically a disaster. Here's the reason why I don't think this is a purely strategic argument. It seems to me to be straightforwardly a deontic entailment. Like, if you have a requirement to pursue justice, you also have a requirement to do what's in your power to preserve the conditions under which your endeavors on behalf of justice could succeed. That seems like a moral argument to me, right? Not merely prudential. Okay. So here's the bigger thought about sustaining democracy. The challenge is to figure out ways to manage belief polarization. Now, I want to suggest that when people start talking about polarization, even in the broader sense of the term, it's too focused and fixated on relations between opposing sides. And maybe that is where the trouble lies, and that's something that needs to be repaired, and so on and so forth, and maybe Joe Biden is right. Unity, unity, unity. We can't be opponents. We can't be enemies. We're merely opponents. And maybe he's right about that stuff. I think we can be enemies, but that's not part of the talk today. Maybe he's right. It still seems to me the case that even if the trouble resides with the ways in which opponents are related to one another in democratic spaces, it just doesn't follow that the place to start the repair work is with those relations. And I want to suggest that, no, the place that we have to start if we want to get a grip on, mitigate, manage belief polarization is inside, right? We need to start with our allies. We need to figure out ways to mitigate the effects of belief polarization within our alliances. There's a broader thought here about how in the literature, especially in the empirical literature about polarization, there is the kind of thing that strikes a philosopher as a conflation, but does not strike empirically minded political scientists as a problem. But they're wrong, and the philosophers are right. for the following reason. What you would have to do to prevent something from happening is not always a good guide about what you should do once it's happened and you want to correct it. So a lot of interventions with democratic publics about polarization have to do with taking measures to arrest polarization. And then it's seen that, well, we've got these good results. We get these people together under certain kinds of circumstances. They don't polarize any further. And then the very next sentence, so we've got a good depolarization intervention. That just strikes me as just a conceptual error, right? Remedy and cure are conceptually different, right? Depolarization is different from preventing further polarization. Okay, I could talk more about that if one likes. All right, so that's why. Now, can we, and I'm wrapping up here, is the real question. That is, if what got us to where we're at, where high levels of political information and a high level of interest in politics and being engaged in politics is positively correlated with a series of democratically troubling attitudes towards people with whom one disagrees, that's where we're at. And if all the polarization stuff is roughly correct, how can we do this? Or given where we are, how can we repair our relations even with our allies? I think that we here have to look a little bit, just for a second, about how polarization works. It's typically thought in another sort of place where philosophers see something conceptually to be very clear that the empirical folks don't see as clear. And again, another case in which it seems to me the philosophers are correct, right? The empirical work on the belief polarization phenomenon is sort of toggles between two different accounts of the mechanism. Like-minded groups are groups where people are very likely only to hear confirming ideas and reasons and points. They're less likely to hear disconfirming information, and that's why you get the shift. Or people in like-minded groups are comparing their level of commitment to what they perceive to be the mean. We've got a sort of sociological reason to want to appear to our friends to be admirably distinct from the mean. And so we're in an arms race with everybody in our group to sort of escalate. And so the whole group escalates. Now, these are two accounts of the mechanism of belief polarization that look like they're committing the sort of fallacy of looking where you've pointed the flashlight. It's really easy to invoke, to instigate, to initiate belief polarization in contexts of like-minded discussion. And so a lot of the empirical literature suggests that, because these are contexts where it's really easy to instigate belief polarization and study it. Those are the contexts that are central to understanding how it works. That looks like a mistake to me, right? Like just, you've searched the room. Well, it was where I happened to be pointing the flashlight, right? It turns out that we've got all kinds of evidence that suggests that in order to get the shift towards extremity, nobody needs to share information. You don't need to be in the same room. There does not need to be in face-to-face or in-person interactions of any kind. Nobody needs to be signaling to others any of the information that would enable them to compare each's level of commitment to the perceived mean of the group. You can get the shift from extremity from the front page of the USA Today newspaper. A pie chart that says, hey, you know the people who are just like you? And this thing that you think? Those people also think this thing. That's enough. So I want to say that the mechanism is political identity corroboration. Feeling like the people who you want to be with are like you and want to be like you. That's what the background image is supposed to be conveying to you. Belief polarization is what goes on in sports stadiums on Sundays during football season. These are a bunch of people who showed up in attire deliberately designed to communicate their allyship with others. They get together. When the team is winning, they start behaving alike. And if you are a sports fan or a music fan, you know what this is like. The team starts winning. The band is playing your favorite song. And all of a sudden you start saying, that's the best drummer ever to play rock and roll. That's the best quarterback ever to play in the NFL. The other team, why would anybody be a fan of that team? They're pathetic. I feel sorry for them. Eventually, and this is easy to show in European context with what they call football, not only do you start feeling sorry for the other team, you start despising them in a certain way. So, belief polarization is what goes on in the stadium when you're surrounded by your allies, feeling at one with them, and discovering, hey, they like the stuff you like too. This is why, by the way, in campaign season, it's not uncommon where I'm from to see gigantic lawns covered in 100 of the very same campaign sign. Just the perception that there's a lot of support for this thing by people who I identify with is enough, it seems. Okay, it's not an accident. Good. So belief polarization can be initiated by mere corroboration, merely feeling the presence of supporting allies, or being merely in the presence of people who you see as the outsiders who are browbeating you is enough to get you into your more extreme self. I want to suggest that the task of managing belief polarization is not fundamentally about reconciling with the other side. It's not fundamentally about healing divisions or unity, unity, unity. Maybe all those things are good and ought to be striven for, but we're not, maybe those are things that you can't strive for directly, but can only be byproducts of endeavors to produce something else. I think that our aim has to be managing belief polarization among our allies. And in order to do that, this is going to be the counterintuitive part. I think citizens need more solitude. They need more opportunity for political engagement all by themselves. Less time on each other's news feeds, less time liking, less time being presented with information from somebody who is telling you implicitly, sometimes very explicitly, if you're a liberal, these are the attitudes that you have to have about this thing I'm telling you about. And more time thinking by oneself, here's the real counterintuitive, if that part wasn't already problematic, about political things that have almost nothing to do with what's going on outside. So not only do we need political solitude, distance from our political allies and enemies, we also need political distance from the politics of the day. We need to expose ourselves to political ideas, thoughts, controversies, positions that have their political significance in being insignificant to the day, to the time we happen to find ourselves in. Now, if that sounds crazy to you, let's ask a question. This is the end. What does democracy look like? If you Google search this, you'll get, 100,000 images that are almost just like this. A bunch of people in a visibly, legibly public spot gathered together for the purpose of expressing a similar political sentiment, whether it's a critique or a demand, or pointing out a problem, or asking a question, or making an objection. Now, democracy does look like that. It involves masses of people working together in public spaces to take responsibility for the political world that they're the part authors of. That's fine. Democracy needs active citizens. Not denying that either. But democracy also looks like that. In addition to active citizens, democracy needs reflective citizens. And the belief polarization phenomenon shows us that certain central, ineliminable, super duper important activities of democracy, not at all disparaging that. In addition to that, we need this because certain modes, indispensable, important, super duper valuable, so on and so forth, of democratic activity counteract and undermine our reflective capacities. We need time for solitary, quiet thinking, distance from our opponents alike, engagement in non-face-to-face contexts, with critical ideas and arguments that transcend the politics of the moment. Reflection that's not prepackaged in the categories of today's politics. We're accustomed to seeing this kind of reflection as a kind of escape, as a kind of withdrawal from politics, maybe even as a luxury enjoyed by those who are favored by the status quo and want to continue the status quo. My argument is not in favor of that. It's just to say our conception of what democratic space looks like needs to be expanded. Democracy needs to retreat from familiar forms of political action on occasion so that we can, for a moment, not leave behind politics, but leave behind the contingencies of the political struggles of the day so that we can see them in the context of a broader democratic project where we're able to envision a democratic future where the existing categories and fissures are no longer relevant, not because we've vanquished and defeated and overcome our enemies, but because by means of democratic activity, we've changed them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, Bob. We have time for questions. Yes.
Can you say your name, please?
Sure. My name's Andrew.
Andrew.
So I think great talk. I think that some of the assumption here is that we're engaging with, potentially engaging with political enemies who share with us at least one thing, which is a shared value of democracy, writ large. So when the stakes might be that you're contending with an enemy, a political enemy, who for whom democracy is actually not all that important, doesn't it then become a situation where the stakes and are also your enemy is playing to win, as you put it? Don't the stakes then become such that you should respond by playing to win? The stakes become infinitely higher?
So maybe. A lot depends on the particularities of the context, right? But I do want to suggest this. Again, don't want to deny that there are views and modes of political engagement that are beyond the pale. People who advocate and engage in those ways are not, I'm ready to say, are not entitled to the kind of regard that we owe to our fellow citizens. It leaves open a question, maybe it's purely strategic, of what to do in those cases. So I'm on board with everything here. I just want to say, we've got real good evidence to think that there are social cognitive dynamics that lead us to have an exaggerated sense of who falls into that category, right? So I want to say, our tendency as engaged democratic citizens is to say, well, look, there are real fascists around. What do we do about them? And then we figure out something about how to combat the fascists around, and then we say, well, what about their enablers? What do we do about them? What about the people who are complicit, right? What about my mom? My mom doesn't know a lot about politics. She votes Republican. What about her? And then eventually we wind up saying, oh, wait a minute. The right political strategic stance to take with respect to that whole collection of people is the stance that we take towards the real fascists. And I want to say, I think that's conceptually putting things the wrong way. So look, who is it around here that falls within the spectrum of acceptable, I'm going to use a Rawlsian term, but try to get away with it, reasonable political opinion that I think is wrong, But nonetheless, their being wrong doesn't disqualify them from, good standing in a democratic community. I just think they're wrong about justice. What do I owe to them? I think is a question we're far less inclined to ask because it's a lot harder, right? Here's the thing about democracy, right? Being right about justice doesn't entitle you to get your way. Being wrong about justice doesn't mean you're not entitled to an equal say. When people who are wrong about justice prevail at the polls, all else being equal, it's wrong for the government not to enact their will. This is not easy stuff to accept, but this is what democracy is, right? So I think we have to start with the idea that there are people who are clearly within the bounds of acceptable political commitment within a democracy, who nonetheless advocate for views that are not consistent with justice. How do I treat them as my equals? That's a harder question. The question of the really sort of Rawlsian unreasonable types, the fascists, the Nazis, whoever you are, I think that's an easier question because I don't think it's really a moral question. I think it's a strategic one, right? As Rawls says, you have to figure out a way to contain them like war and disease. Okay, how do we do that? It's not as messy as the moral question, right? You think the tax rate should be X? I think it should be X plus 2. Now maybe we are allied with respect to some third party, but forget about the third party, right? We've got a disagreement about justice. And I think if you get your way, the world will be made less just. What do I owe you as a citizen? I think that's the trickier question. How's that? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's all right. Thank you.
Oh.
Georgia.
You touched on this like a bit at the end, but I think that like polarization will only increase with the existence of social media, and like would the solution be for media to be required to show more of both sides? Because a lot of the time it's very extreme. Like people only see one side, and it gets very extreme.
Yeah.
And then I guess the solution would be to either get off social media or have social media be required to show both sides.
Right. So a lot of the interventions about both sides stuff looks like that would be really great. That's a great way to prevent something very bad from happening. But now that it's happened, what we have with experiments where you pay somebody a little bit of money, right, to follow the Twitter or Facebook feed of a totally moderate proponent of the other side, all of the extreme attitudes get amplified. It doesn't reduce polarization, right? Mere exposure to what you know is a bot giving the moderate version of the other side's view. Hey, maybe there is a problem with immigration. Maybe we need to do something to control who's coming in and out of the country. Yeah, that's a pretty moderate view. Well, think of a more moderate expression of that view. If you're somebody who's got a typical progressive view about immigration, that just confirms all your negative the experimental results. That's as likely to confirm all the negative attitudes as actually engaging with a real person who's an extremist, who wants to build the wall, for example. So I don't know about the both sides stuff. I think that in another book, a book I published in 2019, I think that the only way out of this part of the story, is to find things to do with other people where you're just not doing politics. Politics has become to so saturate almost all aspects of our social lives together, where you vacation, how many siblings you have, what your occupation is, what kind of school you go to, where you live in the city that you live in. It's now where you buy your groceries, how you get to work, what you do on vacation. It's now so tightly tethered to political identification, such that with 2 or 3 bits of very basic information about you, give me a very clear sense of how you vote. The world around us is an echo chamber. It's not just the social media spaces, right? The chances of if you buy groceries at Whole Foods, chances of you not being liberal are really low, but also low are the chances of running into somebody who's not just like you politically, right? So I think that's got to be the solution, is finding non-political things, not endeavors to reach across the aisle or hear both sides. That's a good strategy for preventing something from happening. But that thing's already happened. See what I mean? Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't do optimism about this.
Nate?
Yeah, I guess I have two questions. The first is about like agonistic democracy, which is something we're talking about in our class in the next couple of days.
Okay?
And I was just wondering whether you thought that like adequately described like kind of the thing that you're thinking, or like moving away from like aggregative democracy or deliberative democracy. But then I have a second question, which is like I hear all the time as a progressive that like the personal is political, and I think that I take up the view that like if I was a woman of color who was receiving a lot of systemic oppression and had for many years, that like it would be impossible for me to go do something in my life that is not political, right?
Right.
Like I can't actually go do that non-political thing. Like it is a moral engagement every time I walk out the door. And so I guess I was wondering what your response is to that kind of argument that like you can't really separate.
Good. So there are different versions of agonistic democracy, some of which I'm very sympathetic to. So I think that if deliberative democracy is aimed at building consensus, I agree with the agonists that that's not only Pollyannish, that's also just a bad idea. Right? Okay. Non-democratic. So agon is central to the democratic enterprise, and consensus and dissensus is the norm, and that's good. So I'm on the side of Chantal and those people. Now, having said that, I had a long dinner with Chantal it's got to be 15 years ago, and she admitted at the end of the day that her distinction between enemy and adversary is really not cutting the pie any differently from the distinction between reasonable and unreasonable in political liberalism, which I thought was a good thing, because some version of that kind of distinction seems to me really important. These are very deep, important issues in democratic theory, but I'm on the side of the anti-consensus people. Okay. Now here's the thing about the second part of the question, or the second question. Maybe the personal is political. We need to know what that means. There are different views about different accounts of what that means. If it means that everything about a person, the full explanation about every aspect of you qua person involves some reference to political phenomena, then it's undeniable. And might be trivial, right? Might just be, okay. Sort of like saying, everything's historical. What does that mean? Well, the full explanation of any event is going to have to talk about more distant things that have happened in the past. It seems to me like it's obviously true, but maybe not all that surprising. Now, the personal can be political. Well, you can accept that while denying that everything has to be politics. Right? Because remember, politics is about ascriptive identities, right? It's about the world coming to you prepackaged in terms of forces that you did not author and fitting you into a position within that spectrum. Now, still you might say, well, wait a minute. Finding non-political things to do with other people is going to be easier for some people than others, and might even be it's easy for people when it is easy for them in light of some social advantage, maybe unjustly gotten, or at the very least undeserved. Maybe. But it seems to me that those who do benefit from that kind of advantage should have more things to do. Remember, the overdoing democracy thesis is not letting you off the hook. It's saying there's more stuff to do. All the democratic stuff you think you got to do, the canvassing, the calling, the writing the checks, the getting out, yeah, you got to do all that. You also have to do this other thing in addition, not instead of, but in addition. Now, when someone says, well, only advantaged people can do that extra thing. Like, well, that's the right dialectic result. You're more advantaged? You should have more stuff to do. You should be required to do more things. So I'm not worried about that. Is that all right? Good.
Jessica?
You had mentioned earlier that the entire world is like this echo chamber around us. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about belief polarization in relation to geography, more specifically what it means for the growing, not just the growing political and economic divide between rural America and those of us in metro cities, but the way that each side is growing to think of each other as less deserving of being entitled to certain democratic rights. In my mind, I feel like those of us in metro cities are slowly, gradually starting to believe the other side as less deserving of certain democratic rights, but I was wondering about your thoughts.
So the geography stuff is really interesting. It turns out that even in large metropolises in the United States, particularly over the last 15 years, like New York City, for example, if you are a conservative voter and you live in New York City, I probably can guess where in New York City you live, right? That used to not be the case, by the way, right? This is a relatively new phenomenon. Same goes for Chicago and LA, right? These are typically pretty liberal centers, but if you tell me I'm a conservative and I live in LA, I'm almost positive just maybe with a couple of other questions, I could probably tell you be really specific about what part of LA you live in. Now, maybe that in itself is not such a terrible thing, right? Maybe Aristotle got, one or two things right. Maybe one of them is, we're these kinds of social creatures, like goes with like, we like to feel at home with the people who are around us. Maybe that's not so terrible. So maybe it's not surprising that under social conditions where historically citizens, United States citizens, have more and more latitude over where they live because commuting is so much easier, right? Of their lifestyles, what food they eat at home, because we've got more and more latitude over the conditions under which we live. Generally, people decide, we can make the world in our own image. We do, right? So we live in places with people who think the same or say the same stuff that we do, drive the same cars, wear the same clothes, make the same money, work in the same occupation, send their kids to the same kinds of schools, so on and so forth. What I think is where that becomes bad is when it becomes as pervasive as it's become. So that right now in the United States, somebody simply needs to find out how close you live to a Cracker Barrel restaurant in order to have a really strong bit of information that can predict how you voted. The closer you live to Cracker Barrel, the more likely it is that you did not vote for Barack Obama, for example. And by the way, it goes the same way with Whole Foods. The closer you live to a Whole Foods, the chances, if you live close to a Whole Foods, the chances that you voted for Barack Obama are like in the 80s, right? Now, it's amazing, right? You want to say, well, is that so bad? Well, once you start adding up all of this is Massachusetts, so it doesn't work in Massachusetts because Dunkin' Donuts is a Massachusetts company. Anywhere else in the country, if you buy your coffee at Dunkin' Donuts, the chances that you vote conservative are incredibly high. If you buy your coffee at Starbucks, the chances that you do not vote conservative are incredibly high. All of that might not seem so bad until you start adding it all up. You say, well, wait a minute. So not only are my neighborhoods, the schools, congregations for worship, workplaces, social spaces, public parks, not only are these are all now very sorted according to partisan identity. What that means is that your chances of having an unplanned encounter with somebody who's not just like you go way, way down. That's correlated with the chances that your understanding of what people who are not like you are like comes from the people who are like you. That's really likely. And that starts seeming to me to be democratically dysfunctional. It's like, wait, well, my conception of the people who don't vote like me comes from the people who do vote like me, who are interested in all kinds of ways to promote a certain view of what those people are like and what they're after and what they say and what they think. An opportunistic conception of those things. Like that looks problematic to me democratically. Is this getting at your answer? So I think that when no particular thing individually looks to me even lamentable, right? But put the whole package together, you see the entirety of social space is now sorted according to partisan identity. Here's the thing that negative attitudes towards interpartisan marriage are now more intense in this country than negative attitudes towards interfaith or interracial marriage, just for example. Now again, you might say, so what? But when you put it in with the long list of the rest, like, whoa. Partisanship now is not about what's your view about taxation or regulations with respect to businesses. It's not about that stuff at all. In fact, the American populace, forget about, party spokespersons and leaders and politicians. The American citizen or American citizens are no more divided over actual public policy questions than they were 40 years ago. They're roughly as divided as they were 40 years ago. They're not more divided. It feels like they are, right? Why? Because interpartisan animosity has skyrocketed despite any commensurate change in partisan policy attitudes among citizens. The parties have become more opposed in their policy ideas. The average American citizen is horrified by, or let me put it this way, the Texas abortion restriction is incredibly unpopular even among conservative citizens in the country. I was growing up, first-time voter, abortion was the thing that divided everybody. The country's not divided along those lines anymore. It's not divided along policy lines at all. Partisanship is now an identity. It's a lifestyle choice. Conservatives, last point on this, conservatives and liberals report fundamentally different attitudes about parenting, about the desirability of sidewalks in their neighborhood, for example. And also, they express fundamentally opposed attitudes about what shopping is. Conservatives think shopping is supposed to establish your rank in an order, some experiments suggest, whereas liberals think it's supposed to make you stand out from an order. So you buy the fancy outfit to stand out. If you're buying the fancy outfit to show that you're on top, that's an important partisan difference. It's a pretty robust partisan difference in attitudes about shopping. Very puzzling.
I'd like to hear more about the sidewalks, but Professor Perek.
I had the same thought. Thank you for your talk. I sometimes say this and don't really mean it, but I really mean it. Like, it gave me so much to think about and to connect with other issues and
Cool.
politics. So some of my students are in my economic justice class, and we're reading Michael Sandel's book, The Tyranny of Merit. And the very last image that you had, I wanted to ask a question about that. The person of color sitting in the library, deeply engrossed in a book. He says that the big divide in the country is between who has a college degree and who doesn't. And those who are left behind by globalization have this intense resentment towards the elite, that they feel like look down on them and don't care about them.
Good.
As I was looking at that image, I thought it was like a poster for the liberal elite. Like just the idea of having a library, having familiarity, that you know what books to read, that you have the time and leisure to explore ideas. So, it's just a question of like the solution to polarization that you propose. Does it itself already assume some kind of polarization?
So the longer story, apart from the image, is this is the beginning of a next project on the importance of humanities facing public infrastructure. So I intended that to be a public library, not a university library. So I think all that stuff is really important. The Sandel, I've got all kinds of trouble, as I'm sure you do too, with Sandel's stuff. You all know that Michael Sandel is the inspiration visually for Mr. Burns on The Simpsons?
Mr. Burns?
No.
Yeah. It's a joke, like Mr. Burns has all the anti-Sandelian attitudes, but he's supposed to look like Mike. Go hold it up, and you'll see it. You're like, oh, I can't believe I didn't see that before. So anyway, yeah. So even though I sort of put it as like you need to step back and read Thucydides and do all this sort of liberal arts humanities stuff, and even though I think that, I just want to suggest. You just need to figure out ways to engage with political ideas and thoughts that are just not tethered to existing categories, however that may happen, right? Now, if the idea is, well, isn't that always going to require some intellectual engagement? I'm going to say yes. Is that elitist? Only in an unjust society, right? That's how I would start. So this is ultimately an argument for more access to the sort of John Dewey conception of what the democratic importance of education is. Does that make sense?
It does. Just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
can we do that without looking down on people who can't do that or won't do that?
I don't know. And, I was about to say, I'm happy, but I'm not happy, but I'm willing to concede that, at the end of the day, what democracy would require of us, given where we're at, is just out of our reach.
Thank you.
Jack and then Professor Fellis, but I know I told some students that the talk should end at 1:15. So if anybody needs to go, you can. I know those who are in my class don't need to go right away.
Thank you, Serena, it was nice to have met you.
Really
Thank
nice
you.
talk to you. Thank you again for your time.
Just building off that professor and
Yeah.
how she was talking about like kind of the political context before the isolation, like assuming that the context can't be pre-political, would that isolation then further like belief polarization? Because you're isolating yourself, which can like lead to like all types of like confirmation bias and stuff like that, in which your polarization will only increase because you're not being exposed to like different mindsets.
Well, now remember, the point is not to go by yourself and read Rachel Maddow or watch, Hannity's show, right? So it's not go and do the political thing just outside. I want to suggest, no, what democratic citizens need is exposure to political ideas that don't fit neatly in to the categories and divides over which we are already divided. To see the political project of democracy in terms of a spectrum of opinion and controversies and challenges that goes far beyond the contingent and pretty narrow spectrum of divides that are central to our contemporary struggles, because they're contemporary, for the purpose, ultimately, of taking some step to broadening our sense of what acceptable disagreement is among allies. That's the important thing. I think that if you want to start healing divides with your opponents, we've got to work on figuring out ways to counteract the conformity pressures among our allies. How do we do that? Look at ideas and just to get a sense of how big the world is politically, even how big the world is among democratic thinkers politically. So this is going to be a real philosophy example. But, I said this last week to students, and some thought it was a good idea. Go look at Aristotle's 8 or 9 different definitions of democracy. Right? It's like, whoa, all kinds of different things to think even about what democracy is. Is Aristotle a Republican? Is he a liberal? Like, no, he's neither of those things. Or what is he? Well, that's just a whole other kind of question. I think that the tendency to conflate the urgency of the political moment with the exhaustiveness and universality of the categories, the tools that we use to think through the moment, is one of the real problems for democracy. Everything is urgent. Agreed. The tools and categories that we have for thinking of the urgency of the moment are really contingent in ways that doesn't track their merit, right? And so we start to think that, by the way, just depending on what your social media feed is like, go back to the night of the Met Gala. Look at your social media feed over the text, the rich dress. You will see a level of vitriol among progressives for each other that seem, to me at least, to outstrip, right, the vitriol that they, on ordinary days, sort of direct at their partisan opponents. Now, why is that? I want to suggest, well, it's part of the phenomenon, to put tighter and tighter constraints on what counts as an acceptable opinion among our allies. That's where I think the problem is all over the place, right? It's with the relations between partisan opponents and all the rest, but that's the part where I think it's got to start. I think it's a mistake to start with the relations with the other side. I think what we have to start with is expanding our sense of who can be our ally, because belief polarization constrains that unduly. How's that?
Good, thanks.
Professor Fellis will ask the last question.
Okay, thanks. So
What's your first name again? I'm sorry.
Don.
Don, right, got it.
So we're taking seriously the idea that it might be appropriate to dismiss our enemies because we have this goal of getting at what actually is just.
Right.
So and this is sort of just a question of clarification, like, I'm wondering why we couldn't just run the same argument for purposes of taking seriously the idea of enforcing conformity amongst our allies, because we're trying to get to the thing that's actually just. And so I guess I'm wondering whether you think your argument requires some sort of basic, for lack of a better term, some sort of appeal to epistemic democracy, that it's actually the case that we need diversity of opinions to get at the truth about what's just, or we need not to be moved just by these, cognitive biases, because they're guiding us to irrelevant stuff rather than what's actually the truth. So
Yeah, good. So all that sounds to me right. So in other work, I've developed a particular account of epistemic democracy. So I am on board with, in a very, very broad sense, the kind of Millian thought that the diversity of opinions and the ways in which they are pitted against one another under the right kinds of social conditions is really important for not only forming epistemically meritorious views about justice, but holding on to them, right? So, and I would say that the belief polarization phenomenon fouls not merely the belief forming processes, but it also fouls our ability to hold on to the beliefs that we've got, because they shift in content to think. So if you start off with the truth, you shift away, right? In ways that aren't tracking reasons or evidence or any of the things that you would think belief revision should be responsive to. It's purely social dynamical. So I'm on board with all of that. The argument that I've tried to make here doesn't rely on that, though. It just says, outside of a certain kind of civic relation with your opponents, and I'll say in a second what I mean is really important about that, you can't hold your alliances together. They splinter, because the conformity pressures get so exacting that you start shedding people for being rhinos or fakers or posers, which is what you start seeing happening in lots of political contexts. Now, last point on this, just to get to the epistemic stuff. Given what I claim belief polarization's mechanism is, that it's about identity corroboration rather than filtering of evidence or social comparison, there is some emerging data, and I'm hoping that some experiments will confirm a conjecture that I have, where I want to say that the kind of relation that one has to keep open with one's political opponents should be structured not on engagements where we're fighting pro and con about immigration, but rather structured around the question, why have I not convinced you? What's the vulnerability that you see in my view? Because here's the thing we have to, I think, try to avoid if possible. I think we have to try to avoid, as a mandate of democratic citizenship, that you've got to adopt a kind of fallibilist or even skeptical attitude towards your own convictions, right? That the directive to hold open democratic relations with your opponents can't be rooted in the, hey, what do you know? They might be right? You might have to change your mind. Now, I happen to think all of that's good epistemic hygiene and all the rest, but can't be required of democratic citizens, it seems to me. So I want to say, well, there's still a mode of civic democratic engagement where I don't have to adopt a distanced or skeptical or fallibilistic attitude towards any of my convictions, because the point of our conversation is not for me to weigh your reasons for the position you take on gun control, but I want to hear the ways in which you've misunderstood me and misconstrued me. I want to find out better ways to formulate the truth, as I see it, stronger ways of articulating the view that is correct. That's part of the Millian story too. That's part of the dead dogma business, right? But I think that some empirical stuff is being done now that's aimed at this. Get away from the pro and con interactions and start talking about where is the vulnerability in my position from your point of view, why are you not convinced by me kind of interactions, which I think are epistemically different in a way that if I'm right about the mechanism for belief polarization, ought to result in more significant depolarization than the pro and con stuff. How's that?
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you so much for a wonderful and
Thank you.
congratulations on your book. Feel free to grab one of those
Yes. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your questions.
and go get food.